2021 was another challenging year for all of us. And when the going gets tough, good local government is more important than ever. We had a wide array of guests on the show in the last year: local government leaders, nonprofit organizations, journalists, state officials, and even a U.S. Senator. In this episode, we are taking a look back at some interview highlights from 2021. The full interviews, as well as past episodes, can be found on CCM's YouTube and Facebook pages. We'd like to thank our premier sponsor, Digital Back Office, Palo Alto Networks. Check them out at digitalbackoffice.com or paloaltonetworks.com. The Municipal Voice is the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities podcast in collaboration with WNHH LP 103.5 FM. I'm your host, Matt Ford. As always, be sure to give us a like and let us know what you're thinking in the comments. CCM's Municipal Voice podcast continues to present a key forum on important state-local issues. The views expressed do not necessarily reflect the consensus views of CCM or member municipal leaders.
As early as 2016, when you first became mayor, you were talking about municipal funding structure and how it's kind of broken in the state of Connecticut. And you've been a key advocate for those sort of reforms that we've been talking about at CCM for a while. We did a plan a while back called This Report is Different, where we outlined some things. And among those, we kind of talked about three main areas, which was cost containment, revenue diversification, and regionalism. Why do you think the system in Connecticut is so broken, and how did it get that way?
Well, I think there are a number of ways in which let's just say we don't maximize our efficiencies and we miss opportunities, and we maybe set up some incentives that aren't that helpful to growth. Mm-hmm. One of the basic structural challenges is the most basic organization of our state. I've often said, if you were building a state from scratch, you would not cut a state of 3.5 million people into 169 towns and then duplicate just about every service in every one of those towns. There are very few places in the country that do that, and most of the places that have seen much more rapid growth than we have don't do that. Yeah. So I think we have to be willing to at least acknowledge that we're an outlier in that respect. The level of fragmentation makes Connecticut unique or nearly unique. And even if we don't have the willpower to tackle that in a meaningful way yet, I do think it's important to acknowledge it as a starting point of some of these conversations. Another way in which we are an outlier is the extent of our dependence on property tax as the sole source of locally generated revenue. In many, many states, municipalities, again, of varying sizes, are able to draw on property taxes, but also a share of sales tax or a share of income tax or some other revenue stream beyond property tax. And Connecticut's over-reliance on property tax has a number of problems, and it challenges communities of many different kinds. For one thing, almost every community in Connecticut has seen property taxes rise. It feels like they rise inexorably in many communities, just year after year after year, as the cost pressure requires that. But the other thing is that it creates enormous disparities and inefficiencies in the way that we operate. For example, in my city of Hartford, which is a city of 125,000 people, we are, by median family income, we're one of the poorest communities in the country. That also means, as a dense city and a city in which many, many of our residents are living in poverty or are low income, or are, as the United Way says, asset limited, income constrained but employed. They're working 1, 2, 3 jobs, but still barely able to make ends meet. And a dense community. Yeah. You have a high level of need. But this city of Hartford has roughly the same amount of taxable property as the much smaller suburban community of Glastonbury nearby. Mm-hmm. And we have got about half of the taxable property of the much, much smaller suburban community of Darien down in the southwest part of the state. Mm-hmm. And so you have this vast disparity in the tax base. And the Boston Fed has done a study of what they call the needs capacity gap. That is looking at what does it cost, what should it cost to run an effective, efficient government that delivers the services that are required in various communities, and then what is the tax base that those communities have to draw on. And what it shows is just enormous disparities. I also think that we may see some widening of those disparities as a result of the pandemic, because in a city like Hartford, although this is not true just of Hartford, you're very likely to see higher commercial vacancy rates in the years ahead as commercial tenants rethink their footprint, as they maybe come back into the office but don't come back into the full amount of space. That is going to put downward pressure on property values in the commercial office building market, which makes up a huge part of our taxable property.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, you have some communities, many communities in Connecticut, that have seen a very significant influx of new residents, New York and elsewhere, which has put upward pressure on home values. So you may actually see this disparity in tax base and the need capacity gap, as the Boston Fed calls it. You may actually see that grow in the years ahead. And that's something, too, that I think we have to acknowledge and confront. But the bottom line is, I think a local funding mechanism that drew on multiple sources rather than just one would, I believe, make our communities more resilient, would be more equitable, and also might even get rid of some perverse incentives that very different communities than Hartford have to wrestle with, which is, they may not want to bring that big box store in, but they feel like they've got to, because it's going to help boost their grand list. I think separating out the revenue considerations and the tax considerations from the planning and development considerations could be beneficial for the development of this state.
That's really interesting. Brian, could you talk a little bit about some of the legislative, specific issues that would be coming into play as you're trying to push this agenda forward for the year?
Yeah, I was going to say, I know Mayor Bronin has been very active in some of the revamping of the pilot program, or payment in lieu of taxes. And I think, one of the things that we're looking at is trying to provide equity, especially with towns that host many social services for a regional or within a certain geographic area.
Yeah, because Hartford, as like a lot of cities there, as he mentioned before, they have a smaller tax base because a lot of the things in Hartford are state-owned, or hospitals, or schools, that serve the general area that people come into, but they can't tax. I'm sorry, I just wanted to clarify that for the audience.
So I think it's important that we try to provide some equity in that front, because I think what that'll do is really pressure, especially if we're to fully fund pilot eventually for the city of Hartford and other like towns, that they'll be able to actually, promote growth and promote opportunities within the community. So that's one of our major initiatives this year.
I think that's a really important one, and I think that there is a pretty strong unified support of the CCM membership to push that. That effort to push for more fully funding the pilot formula, payment in lieu of taxes formula, has been a long-standing priority of CCM. But I think we may have an opportunity right now. Senator Looney, the Senate President, has made this an issue that I think he's going to champion. I think more and more people are recognizing the disparities that we talked about before, and the need for revenue diversification, and the fact that some communities are really fighting with their hands tied behind their back when you've got such a huge portion of the property in the city non-taxable by state law. And just to step back for a second to give the basics, Connecticut has for a long time had a formula on the books. It called for towns to get reimbursed at a certain rate for the non-taxable property that they had. That formula has been nowhere near fully funded for a long, long time. And what we're calling for now is both to put more resources into that formula it will help dozens of communities across the state, but also to do it in a tiered way so that the resources are going in a way that's weighted where the need is greatest.
There's hope on the horizon. There's vaccines out there. Are there any plans that you had to put on hold in 2020 that you're anxious to get back to?
The best way I can think about this last year is I feel like, and again, now I'm just speaking for Hartford and speaking for my city. I feel like over the last five years, we started on the 2-yard line. We battled our way up in some pretty tough play. Battled our way up to the just over the 50, and then with the pandemic, we got sacked about 30 yards back. And we just got to get up and get back in the game. In the meantime, we've worked really hard to keep important projects moving forward. So we have development around our baseball park moving forward, which ultimately will be about 1,000 new residential units, mixed-use development, residential and retail. Similarly, down at Park and Main, which is an important intersection that was vacant for about 40 years. We've got buildings going up there as we speak. I could go on and on with a number of projects that we have been able to keep moving even in the midst of the pandemic. But I think the most important thing for us is to get back that sense of momentum, because coming into 2020, you really felt here a level of energy and momentum and investment and confidence I think the city hadn't felt in a long, long time. And COVID was a tough gut punch, and getting back to that is going to take some time. It's going to take some work, but I think we will. But that's what we have to get back to, and ultimately that means getting back the ability to play to the strength of the city, and the strength of a city is bringing people together. Whether it's at the theater, at the stadium, at the restaurant, at the bar, at the festival, at the park, at the riverfront. You need people to be together. That's the beauty and the lifeblood and the energy of a city. And so I am hopeful that once we're vaccinated and we can return to those things, that you'll see that energy and momentum come back faster than it may feel to some like is possible right now.
Hear, hear. I agree. Well, thanks. So one of the big reasons we asked you to join us today was you are participating in the CCM event we are doing soon called Representation Matters. And we're doing it out of the belief that everyone deserves a say in their local government, that glass ceilings should be shattered, and that representation is one of the kind of fundamentals of American government. And kind of from the outset, the fact that we're holding this event recognizes that communities of color have been underrepresented in our town halls and capitals historically. What are some of the barriers that prevent a person of color from running for office?
So once again, thank you for having me. So here in Bloomfield, I think we're very lucky, right? I am the mayor, the first Black female mayor of the town of Bloomfield, but on our current town council, we have 3 other individuals of color. We have Councilor Curtin, who is a Black male, and Councilors Stephanie Calhoun and Danielle Wong, who are Black females. And on our town council, in councils past, we've had representation, but I'm often told that I am one of 2 women here in the state of Connecticut in 169 towns, right? So we obviously see that there is a little problem. I think when it comes to public office, some people are intimidated by the old guard, those who've been there for forever and a day. And some people might feel like it's just an uphill battle and they don't have the resources and or the support to run for public office. I believe honestly that change really does start at your local level. And even though you might be afraid, and even though you might be the only one that looks like you that's running, I say do it afraid. I say do it anyway. If you believe that you have something to offer, definitely do it. It's about being at the table. When I was running for election back in 3 years ago, I was told either you're setting the agenda or you're on the agenda. And I wanted to make sure that my voice was heard and that people that look like me was represented. So I wanted to set the agenda. Yeah. You mentioned, obviously yourself being the first female mayor of color of the town. There's some people on the boards. Is there anything that you see that's unique about Bloomfield that made that possible? Or is it just that there was enough people with the will? So I think at the time, the council that we had previously was there for forever, right? And I think some of the decisions that they made, the town wasn't too happy with, and the town was ready for change. So I think we were at the right place at the right time. Also, Bloomfield is a little unique because I think we're like 57 to 60% Black. So it was also, I think our residents realized that it was time for us to have new people with a renewed vision of what the town could be and could look like. And of course, having people that was there to amplify their voices and the things that mattered to them. I think it was just the right time,
Yeah.
being at the right place at the right time.
And how did you personally make the decision that you wanted to represent your community in Bloomfield? Like, how did you know that you were ready?
Wow. To be absolutely honest, I didn't know if I was ready. But what I did know was there were conversations that were taking place. We were talking about Tamar Rice at the time. We were talking about racial profiling at the time. I had always served my community on different committees. I'm a community servant. So I always tried to get involved. My husband and I, we still are chaplains for the Bloomfield Police Department. So when these conversations were being had, my voice was out there loud and strong, like, no, we have to make changes. Our community have to be reflective. We have to be mindful of how we're treating each other and things like that. So I got involved in conversations, and it was those conversations that led to, hey, why don't you do more with that voice? And I was approached a couple times, and I did turn it down for a couple of reasons. At the time, my children were younger. And I did have in the back of my head that, wow, there's some people on council that's been on council for years upon top of years upon top of years. There's no way. But the more the conversations went on, the more sometimes I was the only me in a room, right? I spoke up for the community. I spoke up for my children, especially my son, and all the other men, in my life, my husband, my brothers, friends. And I thought it became more and more apparent that in order for true change to happen, your voices have to be amplified. You have to be represented, and your voices have to be amplified. And you might have to yell and scream that same story over and over and over again until change happens. Yeah. So I think after a while of lending my voice to different conversations and talking to different people about how we could be better and do better, it was just a natural progression. It was scary, right? Yeah. It was scary because while I had served on different commissions and committees and task force, I never ran for public office. So that was scary. So you have that long conversation with your family, and you have a longer conversation with yourself. And you make that commitment. You make that commitment to adding my voice to being a part of the solution.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing that's interesting, I think, that in what you just said was you mentioned that, you didn't just jump right into being the mayor.
Right.
You were doing other things before, and you were involved in committees and stuff. And I know part of this training, we are also encouraging people not just to run for, the top offices like you have, but also there's boards, there's, smaller ways that people can get involved and help, and perhaps that would lead into bigger things. But if someone's intimidated by the idea of like a big election, they could start with something smaller. But it starts with the idea that you want to serve your community.
Definitely. And that's what it has to be about first, right? So here in Bloomfield, we run for council, and then we vote for mayor and deputy mayor. So I was running for council. Becoming the mayor was a whole different situation. But I agree. It's about getting involved in your community. It's about committing, right? So whether you're going to be on the beautification committee, or you're going to be on the Celebrate Your Town committee, or the library board, or the Board of Education, or your task force, or your human relations committee, whatever it is, you have to see it as a stepping stone to helping to make your town better, right? And then from there, I think it'll be a natural progression. Yeah. You'll see that, okay, so my voice is really helpful here, and I believe that I've added to being right here, but I think that I can add also to being here. And I think people will see that servant heart, and once again, that can be a little Pollyanna-ish, but people can see your desire to help to be a part of the solution and not just your desire for your own personal gain. There's a difference there.
Yeah.
And the way the world is right now, that desire is to be a part of a bigger solution.
There's a lot of problems in need of those solutions, certainly.
Yeah. It can't be about you, because politics after the election is definitely not about you. It's about now trying to reach across the aisles of it's just trying to be bipartisan with the decisions and the policies that are coming down for the best interest of your community.
Yeah. In a Hartford Current article about the training sessions that we're doing coming up, you said that there was some pushback when you did run for mayor, that you ran anyway, and it brought to the mind, nevertheless, she persisted. What was it like to experience pushback, racism in some cases, and then persist and, in fact, win an election?
So it was interesting, right? Because I tell this story all the time. When I was younger, we lived on the borderline of Hartford and Bloomfield. So I thought I could just choose and tell which town I lived in, right? And I would always say Bloomfield, because I thought Bloomfield was so wonderful. It was close enough to Hartford, but it was far enough away. The school systems were great. The neighborhoods looked really good. So I've always said I lived in Bloomfield before I actually lived in Bloomfield, but that's just between us. But you also hear that back in the 70s, Bloomfield was an all-American city. And here we are now. And you're saying that I don't represent you. You don't like the way that I look. You don't like the way that I sound. You don't like my hair. It was fuel for me, actually, because we had come such a long way as a town, as a people. And there was things that I was offering my community. I was serving my community. And those voices, even though they were there, they were so, I wouldn't say that they were mute, because I heard them, but I listened to them really on that low volume, because there were so many other people that were supporting the slate, the six of us that were running at the time, and excited about the change and the choice and the trust and the transparency that we were promoting, that those voices, they didn't become amplified until I was in my quiet moment thinking, really, is this the right thing to do? And when you have those thoughts and you remember the reason why you're actually doing this, it kind of drowns them out. That's why I said, sometimes you have to do it scared. You get yourself a group of people that support you, and do it anyway, because what you have to feel like what you're offering is really in the best interest of your community.
Thanks for having me.
So the Yankee Institute for Public Policy Studies says on the website that it is a research and citizen education organization developing for and advocating for free market, limited government, and public policy solutions in Connecticut. You're one of the oldest state-based think tanks in the nation. What are some examples of the work that your organization does?
I'd say we do two categories of work. Some of it is the really important, deeper policy analysis. So Yankee was one of the organizations that's been sounding the alarm about the state's debt and pension problems for much longer than, much earlier than the political class was. And we also do some really important work on a daily basis, and that's through investigative journalism. We're lucky enough to have an in-house journalist, Mark Fitch, who does a really terrific job of letting people know what's going on in state government with a real Joe Friday approach. Just the facts, ma'am.
Is there anything else that came out of this proposed budget that you think is good news?
Well, first and foremost, I want to give the governor another heaping of credit for proposing a budget that's balanced, using reserves responsibly, without turning up the dial on any state tax rates. He faced not insignificant pressure from a lot of political interests to do that, and he said no. He's got a tough road to hoe in the out years in terms of addressing a structural deficit long term. But for him to have said no to increasing taxes further, and to have just a general recognition that, as he puts it, we need more taxpayers, not more taxes, that's good news for the state's economy. the challenge he also faced putting together a budget in the middle of a pandemic is that it's not a great time to try to do structural reforms. It's not a great time for him to try to untangle 20 or 30 or 40 years of bad policy that has put Connecticut into the position that it is, and that is having the second highest tax burden in the country. So the not enough can be said about the absence of broad-based tax increases, because he very easily could have done it and blamed the pandemic.
Yeah, he kind of had some cover. He could have gotten away with a lot this year and probably would have gotten swept under the carpet news-wise because there's so much else going on.
You can take some of the absolute worst public policy solutions, tack on the words "because of the pandemic" at the end, and have a pretty good shot at getting away with it. And he chose the more responsible route, so he deserves a lot of credit for that.
Mm-hmm. And was there anything other than that in the budget that you saw as a positive?
I'd say that's the
single kind of the main, yeah. So if that's the single biggest positive, I'm sure there's some points in there that maybe you thought were not positive, that were maybe bad policy. What are some examples of what you think might be bad policy in the budget, and what research has your organization done on some of those issues?
Well, Yankee has been pretty critical about the Transportation and Climate Initiative. This was a proposed multi-state agreement to basically artificially increase the cost of gasoline and diesel fuel. Okay. It's ostensibly a mechanism for reducing carbon emissions. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, for the people planning it, New York, New Jersey, and several other large states opted not to join. So Connecticut ended up alone with Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Washington, D.C. as joining it. The governor has legislation as part of his budget proposal that would make Connecticut part of this. And it's probably the biggest problem associated with it, besides the fact that you're going to increase the cost of living and doing business in Connecticut, is that it kicks the can down the road on the Special Transportation Fund. That is to say, the state's dedicated fund for paying for highway and bridges. We have structural problems with that fund. We had it long before this year, before the pandemic. Mm-hmm. That is to say, cars were getting more efficient, costs were going up, so you had less gas tax money coming in, you had more costs going out the door, you have a bigger share of state roads in mediocre to bad shape, and the governor has proposed two taxes, TCI and a highway use tax on certain bigger trucks, as a way to temporarily plug the hole. Instead of taking
what's the TCI? I'm sorry. What's TCI stand for?
Transportation and Climate Initiative.
Okay, thank you.
It's I glossed over it, but it's essentially a credit-based system where anyone who wants to sell gasoline or diesel in those three states or DC would have to buy credits. It's
one of those kind of carbon offset sort of situations.
It would be more academically honest if it were about offsets. That is to say, if it weren't about creating a big pot of money that the states would then get to spend wherever, within reason, wherever they so choose. So 35% of TCI money has to be spent on climate justice matters in very specific communities. And the problem there is, anytime you're taxing drivers, you should be using that money to pay for the roads and bridges that they drive on. That reduces the pressure for us to have to take other taxes, sales taxes, income taxes, and plow that money over there. So it's a dangerous game when you start skimming money away from what should be a dedicated fund.
Senator, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Also sitting in, we have Mike Muzinski from our advocacy team. You have a little bit of expertise on this. So just to start off, we noted in our intro that in 20 years, you've gone from our state legislature here in Connecticut to being a United States Senator. How do you stay abreast of information about your constituents here in Connecticut, as well as the needs of your committees on the federal level?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. Really glad to be with you. Yeah, I mean, listen, first of all, I've had a really unique perspective in that I started out as an intern for Rich Balducci when he was a state senator, when I was going to high school in Connecticut and then college out of state. Got the chance to do almost every job there is, from planning and zoning commissioner, now the United States senator. I've been able to sort of see state government, federal government from almost every perspective. But your question is, how do you sort of remain in touch with folks. Well, first of all, I live in Connecticut. I got a house in Hartford, just south of downtown. I spend lots of time in Hartford every weekend. But there is a risk as you start to sort of get jobs like this in which, you're away from the state during the week, that you can lose touch. So I try to, be as inventive as I can about sort of making sure that I'm sort of talking to people, whether it be pre-pandemic, doing office hours outside of supermarkets or walking across the state for a week every summer, holding telephone town halls on weekday evenings where I take, every manner of question. I try to stay, as plugged in as I can in as many different ways as I can. I think
Excellent.
Sort of get higher up on the political food chain, you've got to be a little bit more proactive about making sure you're listening to people in your state. But I think I've been able to be pretty good at it.
I mean, thankfully for the small state of Connecticut, as you mentioned, you have in fact walked across the state of Connecticut as a way to get to know people. I know with the pandemic, there was a problem. Do you see that coming back?
I hope it does. The pandemic has certainly changed my ability to do it, but so has 2 leg surgeries in the last year. So as I start to advance in age, my body starts to deliver messages to me about the wisdom of walking 100 miles over 5 days. And so it may be that the orthopedics rather than pandemics will dictate whether I can continue to do the walk across Connecticut. But I love it. It's a great way for me to, first of all, just enjoy the state. I mean, I've lived in Connecticut my entire life, grew up there. But you see it differently when you're walking across it rather than driving across it. And, that walk across the state is really grounding for me. One of the other risks in this job is that you start thinking that the things that they talk about on the cable news shows actually matter to regular people. But in fact, it doesn't. That's all driven for ratings based upon the very small portion of the population that watches cable news. What matters to people in your state are the same things from year to year. How good are the schools? Are my streets safe? How much taxes am I paying? Can I get a better job than I have now? Those are the things that really matter to folks.
And so you feel like by meeting people face to face, you're hearing things that you wouldn't necessarily hear inside the Washington bubble.
Yeah, I think you've got to recognize that the folks who call the office are important, but they sort of tend to be the squeaky wheel, right? Those are the people who are most sort of plugged in to politics are the folks who call your office. And listen, every week I get a readout of exactly who called the office. I get a sampling of correspondence. I pay close attention to who calls and writes. So people should know that you have impact if you call or write the office or email. But that's probably 5% of the population of Connecticut. My job is not just to represent the people who call. My job is to represent everybody else. So yeah, the walk across the state, the telephone town halls, the office hours, those are all designed to just make sure that I'm picking up what matters to everybody, not just the folks who are sort of watching politics on a daily basis.
In an article in the Hartford Courant, you described the worry about being able to afford living in the state of Connecticut, and also talk a little bit about the aggressive property tax system. What do you think can be done to help relieve the dependence on property taxes in Connecticut?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think property taxes are a nutso way to fund government. I mean, it is a regressive tax by and large that has very little to do often with your ability to pay. It provides a disincentive to the improvement of property, and it ultimately is a disincentive for municipalities to build affordable housing because those houses don't tend to have the property tax revenue that the big 3,000 square foot, 4,000 square foot homes do. So listen, I'm not in charge of the state government. They'll make their own decisions about how to levy taxes, but I've always been supportive of ideas connected to either getting rid of certain property taxes, like the vehicle tax, levying that at a statewide level, or regionalizing at the very least the way in which we levy taxes so that you're distributing out the tax burden across city and suburb. in Hartford, we pay pretty high property taxes, in part because we got tons of untaxable property inside the city of Hartford. And increasingly, we don't have a lot of good commercial property because they've all moved out to the suburbs. So, there's a way to distribute the burden in a way that's less regressive, less of a disincentive to provide affordable housing options.
Well, congratulations on becoming the president of the Connecticut Police Chiefs Association.
Thank you.
Previously served as vice president of the association, and you've been the chief for Danbury since 2016.
Right.
Can you tell us a little bit about what drew you to the profession of policing and how kind of your career path led you to be, the top slot in Danbury?
Okay. Well, I was born and raised in Waterbury. My father was a police officer in the 50s and 60s and early 70s. So I don't have much of a memory of him as a police officer because I was very little when he was injured and retired. And my mother was a school teacher, so I think public service has just always been in our blood, in our background. So I was born and raised there, and I joined the Waterbury Police Department in 33 years ago now. Wow, time flies when you're having fun, I guess. And it was great to serve in the community where I grew up for 20 years. I went up through the ranks there. I left there as the assistant deputy chief, where I was the chief of the entire uniform division for the department. Then I went to Stratford. I was the deputy chief for a year and a half and the chief for 5.5 years there. And then now former Mayor Boughton gave me this tremendous opportunity to come to the city of Danbury, and I've been here ever since.
A big policy change, really, was Senate Bill number 1201, an act concerning the responsible and equitable regulation and adult use of cannabis, which legalized marijuana, though it is still federally prohibited. The implications of this bill are far-reaching, but to start, how does this change policing?
Well, I mean, from the enforcement standpoint, it certainly changes it, that it's not something that we're going to be able to enforce, whether it's through a summons or through a custodial arrest. So that's, that's the first thing that changes for us. Certainly the rules have now changed. If we smell marijuana in a car on a motor vehicle stop, and the rules change clearly if someone is in possession of less than the required amount of marijuana. So, those are the things. Those are the immediate changes. How it impacts everything that we do in terms of motor vehicle stops, in terms of whether or not someone's impaired or our accident rates. That all remains to be seen. So it's too early to tell for us as to whether or not it's going to have a major change in the way that we're used to doing things.
Yeah, I know. Did you feel like you were given enough time at the police force for training to handle such a change, where it was legalized less than 2 weeks after it was signed into law? So, how are your officers on the ground and the community handling the kind of quick change?
Sure. If there's one criticism of the bill, it is the speed with which it came out. I do not think that we've been given enough time to train, enough guidance that has come out for our people to know exactly what it is that they can and cannot do. I think probably the same is can be said for people within the communities. Like, what does this mean? Which is why you see a lot of municipalities putting a moratorium on dispensaries and things of that nature until they can put committees together to really study this issue and figure out what is the best way to move forward.
Right now in Connecticut, it seems like things are moving in the right direction. Rainy Day Fund is reaching its highest level in a long time. One of your articles, you said that even coronavirus-induced recession couldn't stop analysts from forecasting big surpluses for the next 2 years. Did something click? Does Malloy deserve some sort of credit for this? What got us to where we are at the moment?
What got us to where we are at the moment are two things. And both of them are very unstable. One is simply, and this is sort of a post-2009 phenomenon, post the Great Recession, and that is the stock market almost seems to be, I won't say it's entirely, but the the appearance is almost as though the stock market has become disconnected from the rest of the economy. We had unprecedented unemployment during the pandemic. And after a brief dip, the Dow and the NASDAQ surged. I mean, the Dow Jones Industrial Average is about 33% higher than it was before the pandemic. Not, I want to emphasize, not 33% higher than it was after the pandemic, after the stock market dipped. It dipped in March of 2020, and by June, it had regained all its value, and then it exploded. But at the same time, Connecticut, at the worst of the pandemic, for example, lost 292,000 jobs. Here's some comparison. We lost about 120,000 jobs in the Great Recession. That was the recession of 2007 to 2009. 120,000 versus 292. It took us a decade to regain about 90 of those 120,000 jobs. And that's all we regained when the pandemic struck.
We weren't all the way back to where we were before that. When this whole,
and by the way, we're still not all the way back from, forget the pre-Great Recession. We're not back from the 292 we lost in the pandemic. We still have about 60,000 jobs to go. We had, before the pandemic struck, an unemployment rate between 4 and 5%. But in some of our most impoverished urban areas, unemployment was between 13 and 14% before the pandemic. You say, well, then how come the state revenues didn't plunge? Well, here's another thing. We've never in modern history had a period of time where people were making significantly more money unemployed than they were employed. Think about the jobs that were lost during the pandemic. A lot of them were service jobs, restaurant jobs, lower paying jobs.
Minimum wage or close to,
Right. The average unemployment benefit's $300 a week. The federal government, and I'm not saying this was a bad thing, gave that $300 plus up. So all of a sudden, somebody employed is not getting $300 a week, but $600. Okay, $600 a week is the equivalent of making $31,000 a year. So somebody who was a busboy who lost, a job, all of a sudden is making more money unemployed. Well, guess what? Most of that money is also taxable, Matt. So the state's income tax receipts don't go down. Why? Well, we get our income tax receipts, 2/3 of them from paycheck withholding. Well, these people weren't getting a paycheck, but they were getting unemployment benefits that were taxable. So the money kept coming into the state's coffers. The other 1/3 came from Wall Street. It's from quarterly returns that were filed regarding capital gains or dividends. Those didn't just hold firm, those exploded. So the temptation is, if state government's fine, the economy must be fine, right? Well, we really don't know. The federal plus-up money for the unemployed just went away in September.
So that's going away. That's not a permanent addition to the income tax.
I'll finish my rant just saying we've been on really, really good economic Novocaine, and it's just beginning to wear off. And now we're going to kind of feel what kind of dental surgery we've been going through over the last year.
It's been kind of masking the real pain that we're going to eventually take from this hit. It's pushed it down the line, and probably a good thing that it did. Getting through the worst of this pandemic, we needed that to keep people. Ideally, some people should not have gone to work and should have stayed home and taken that money. But it's not a permanent situation where we're going to have this extra money.
You don't feel the pain of the surgery until the painkiller wears off.
So we talked first about, how your first stint was in television, because that's been kind of a thread throughout your career. But you have done a lot of other stuff. In fact, you left a permanent position to work in politics for a while. What made you decide to jump on to working the Linda McMahon campaign for Senate?
Interestingly enough, I had 2 very young children at the time. They were toddlers, and I was working the overnight shift at Channel 8. It was a 3 a.m. wake up call, get to the station, and work through the afternoon until about 1. And then I would come home and have to pick up these 2 little kids. And it was a really exhausting schedule. And I did it for 10 years. And I had asked several times, could I please change? And management at the time didn't see me changing that shift. They liked me in the mornings, and it just didn't work out. And so I said, well, I've got to change something, because for me, I wasn't a nice person at home because I was so exhausted. invested, and I wanted to be there for the kids, and I wanted to be there
Definitely.
for my husband. And so, you make these really life-changing choices. And so I decided to look around for another job. And interestingly enough, I knew the person that was putting the campaign together. And so I reached out and said, I would be interested in getting involved in whatever it is that you're doing. Because at the time, I have to take that back. I knew they were putting a campaign together. I didn't know for who, and I didn't know for what position. So I sent my resume. I had an in-person meeting. I had to sign off on a non-disclosure. I met with the candidate, and within the first 10 minutes, I did not know who she was. And we laugh about that to this day. Got to talking, got into conversation, and she mentioned a little bit about her family business and that her husband Vince was really the spearhead of their company WWE.
A few events, yeah.
So in my mind, I'm there for an interview for a job, and it wasn't clicking. So when we were growing up, my brother was a big wrestling fan. I mean, he had all the little the dolls,
Action
the ring
figures and stuff. Oh, that's because they changed from the WWF when your brother was a kid to the WCW. That's what threw you off right there.
Right. So in the course of conversation, I said, I'm so sorry. I only knew her as Linda. I didn't even recollect the last name being told to me. And I said, can you just dial it back for a second? Did you say that your husband was Vince and that the family company was WWE? And she said, yes. And then I was like, oh my goodness. So it was a very bizarre start, but we've become wonderful friends. It was a great opportunity. I immediately said yes when they said, could I come on? I was doing digital content for them at first, and then did traveling press secretary for the rest of the year up and through the election. And it was fascinating to me as a journalist to see how a campaign is built.
Yeah, what kind of things did you see coming from the other side, really?
I had no idea how much was involved. I mean, you're building from the ground up. I mean, talk about grassroots. And, just all the preparation that goes into it, getting the word out and the message out. I apologize, that's the dog.
Hey, puppy. He wants attention too.
Yes, he does.
Your political work didn't end with Linda's end of her Senate bid. You then went on to working for the Connecticut Republican office for a few years.
Right.
And then from there, you kind of went into some town government, into the Wethersfield Board of Ed. How did you kind of make those leaps? What was the progression there?
So the leap from Linda's campaign into the Senate Republican office was because during the course of the campaign, you're meeting so many people and networking. And our campaign manager at the time was a former state senator. So when the rest of us needed jobs after she lost that campaign, we all sent our resumes in, and I sat down and talked to Senator McKinney and Senator Fasano, who were the leaders at the time, and they really wanted to expand their press corps within the caucus. And so it was a natural fit. And I was really grateful to be able to do that. And that actually allowed me to understand more the statewide offices and how the senators and the House of Representatives worked, the transition of a bill from committee out onto the floor. So that was super interesting to me, and I definitely learned a lot.
Just understanding the process of how stuff gets done.
Absolutely. And with my background on television, I was able to put the senators in a position where I knew what the reporter needed in order to tell the story about the policy that these senators were trying to enact. So that to me was a great learning point. I feel like going from the federal office down to the state office was super just helpful. Then getting from there into the Board of Ed, I said to myself, there's a need for a change here, because my kids at the time were in elementary school. They were getting off the bus to go to my in-laws after school, and the bus would stop at the house near them. There was no sidewalk, and it was a very major intersection coming off of Route 3 in Wethersfield. And I had these two little kids who were getting off the bus, and the bus was leaving and the rest of the traffic was going by. And I said, oh my God, they're going to get hit. This is not good. So my mother-in-law said to me, she waits in the driveway, but the bus takes off. And so I said, well, that's not right. So I called the school system. They said, you have to go to a Board of Ed meeting and try to talk to the superintendent. And so that's exactly what I did. I kind of explained the situation. They sent somebody out there to do measurements, take video. We followed up, and they were unwilling to change the stop. But what they did do was they instituted a new rule, and where the driver would have to wait until the kids reached the driveway. Because even in wintertime, you'd get snow and ice pack, and they'd be walking in the street because they could no longer walk on the lawn. So it really was a scary thing as a parent. And so you do what you do, you fight for your kids. And so that experience said to me, you know, I need to get involved. I need to understand more about my local community and what's happening. And so I ran for office. I did Board of Ed for 2 years, and then eventually went on and did town council for 4. And so it was an eye-opener. I felt like, you know, your local municipalities and the rules that get changed locally, those affect your everyday life. And that is huge, which is why when there's an election during an off year and it's not a presidential election, people need to get out and vote, because that is exactly what happens in your everyday life. People are making decisions for you, and you really need to know who those folks are. It's super important.
You are listening to the Municipal Voice on WNHH 103.5 FM.
You know, that's not the end of your local politics career by any means, though. Then you were working with Mayor Aaron Stewart of New Britain, a city that has been seemingly developing rapidly. Every time I drive through, it seems like there's something new going on. A lot of it kind of tied to like transit-oriented development and those sort of things. What was it, just as fast-paced working in City Hall as it seems from the outside?
Yeah, very much so. Mayor Stewart and I met in the Republican caucus. She was an aide for now Senator Kelly, who is the leader of the Senate Minority Caucus. And we developed a relationship and a friendship. And at the time, she was running for Board of Ed in New Britain. And so we would often talk about Board of Ed situations. And then when she ran for mayor and won, of course, everyone in the caucus was very proud of her and tried to support her. So we maintained the friendship, and eventually she was looking for a chief of staff, and she said, would you be willing to come on board? And I thought to myself, what a great opportunity. I'm not really sure what that person does, but I'm willing to learn. So like anything, you take the leap. And it was fascinating. I describe it as drinking from a fire hose. It was incredibly difficult at first. It took me a solid year to get my bearings, but everyone was super helpful. And it really is about making sure the train stays on the track. There are so many things that happen at that level. I mean, it's a city of 75,000 people, and you have multiple unions, you have thousands of employees, you have dozens of departments that are actually making this city run. And you have a very strong mayor who is driven, and she really wants to make sure that her city gets transformed into what she's envisioning and what, the master plan holds. So it was a lot. It was definitely a lot. I would say you have to set boundaries, and she and I would talk about that all the time about, making sure that we took time for ourselves and our families, because you can get burnt out of that really quick.
We'd like to thank all of our guests from 2021. I'd like to thank our premier sponsors, Digital Back Office Palo Alto Networks, who you can check out at digitalbackoffice.com and paloaltonetworks.com. The Municipal Voice is a co-production by CCM and WNHH LP 103.5 FM. Kevin Maloney is our executive producer, Christopher Gilson is our producer, Harry draws on the boards, and I'm Matt Ford, your host. Be sure to check out our Facebook page and give us a like, and watch out for our CCM chat series on our YouTube page.